The year is 1942. The world is burning in the midst of history's bloodiest war. As Europe is crushed under Nazi jackboots, German U-boats are hunting British ships in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. Every day, hundreds of innocent sailors perish in the cold waters. Hitler's war machine, running like clockwork, seems unstoppable. But in the dark offices of London, shrouded in cigarette smoke, a group of men with insane courage are busy planning the impossible. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. What if I told you that one of the craziest, most unbelievable, and most cinematic operations of World War II took place on a forgotten island off the west coast of Africa during a cocktail party? Would you believe me? What if I told you that a handful of British agents stole German and Italian ships from a neutral country's harbor right under the enemy's nose, and in doing so nearly started a Third World War? Would you believe your own eyes? Sounds too incredible to be true, doesn't it? But it is true, and I'm about to tell you this story. This is a story that even Hollywood couldn't write. This is an adventure that made James Bond creator Ian Fleming's eyes light up as he scribbled furiously in his notebook. This is Operation Postmaster, and this story is 100% real. If you're new to this channel, let me warn you right now, you won't be watching ordinary history videos here. Here, you'll discover real stories that leap from the dusty pages of history, stories that will freeze your blood and take your breath away. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and join me on this journey, because this story will glue you to your seat. Now let's travel back to those dark days of 1942. In the early days of World War II, Britain was fighting an entire continent alone. France had fallen. Poland had been crushed. Holland, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, all of them were groaning under the Nazi flag. Had not yet entered the war, and Britain, in Churchill's famous words, was living through its darkest hour. But the British didn't know how to give up. Throughout history, they were a nation that became most dangerous when their backs were against the wall, and this time would be no different. Churchill knew that conventional warfare methods wouldn't be enough. The enemy had to be struck not just on the front lines, but everywhere, in every way, at every moment. And this is precisely when one of history's most secretive and legendary organizations stepped onto the stage, the Special Operations Executive, SOE for short. What was this organization? Founded in 1940 by Churchill's order, SOE was officially listed as a branch of the Ministry of Economic Warfare, but everyone knew this was just a front. SOE's real mission was far darker, far more dangerous. Churchill's order to SOE became legendary, set Europe ablaze. And SOE would do exactly that. SOE agents weren't ordinary soldiers. These were elite operators who moved in shadows, spoke multiple languages, knew not just how to use weapons, but how to build bombs, and were trained well enough to kill enemies with their bare hands if necessary. They parachuted into enemy territory, organized resistance cells, blew up bridges, derailed trains, and silently eliminated Nazi officers in dark alleyways. But one of SOE's most dangerous operations would take place thousands of kilometers from Europe, on the west coast of Africa, and the target of this operation would be a small but strategically important island, Fernando. If you're enjoying this story, hit like and subscribe. Fernando, known today as Bioko, was located in the Gulf of Guinea, just off the west coast of Africa. It was part of Spanish Guinea and under Spanish control. To understand Spain's position in World War II, we need to go back a bit. General Francisco Franco had become the dictator of Spain in 1939 after a bloody civil war. During that civil war, Hitler and Mussolini had sent Franco weapons, money, and soldiers. Luftwaffe pilots had practiced on Spanish soil, bombing Guernica and committing one of the greatest war crimes in human history. Franco never forgot this help, but Franco was a cunning politician. Despite all Hitler's pressure, he managed to keep Spain officially out of the war. Spain remained a neutral country, but as everyone knew, this neutrality existed only on paper. Spanish ports, especially those in distant colonies, had become safe havens for German and Italian ships. Nazi agents roamed freely throughout Spain, gathering intelligence, and the Santa Isabel harbor in Fernando Po had become a perfect base for enemy vessels. Here we arrived at the critical point of our story. In late 1941, British intelligence began receiving alarming reports. 3 enemy ships were anchored in the harbor of Santa Isabel, the capital of Fernando Po. And these ships posed a serious threat to Allied shipping. The first was the Duchessa d'Aosta. This 7,872-ton Italian cargo ship appeared to be an innocent merchant vessel. But British intelligence was certain the ship was gathering information about Allied ship movements and transmitting it to German submarines. Behind every sunken British ship, there was perhaps intelligence coming from this very vessel. The second was the Likomba. This 200-ton German tugboat might have looked small, but it was extremely valuable. With its powerful engines and sturdy construction, it was critical for German naval operations. The third was the Bibundi. Also a German ship, the Bibundi stored fuel needed for diesel engines. This fuel could allow German submarines to hunt in the Atlantic for much longer periods. These 3 ships sat silently in the warm waters of the Gulf of Guinea, contributing to the deaths of British sailors. And the British could no longer tolerate this. Something had to be done. But there was a problem, a big problem. Fernando Po was neutral Spanish territory. According to international law, attacking a neutral country's harbor would mean declaring war on that country, and Britain absolutely did not want Franco to enter the war on Hitler's side. If Spain joined the war, Gibraltar would be in danger. If Gibraltar fell, access to the Mediterranean would be cut off. This would be a disaster for British war strategy. So Britain had to somehow neutralize these ships while being careful not to drag Spain into the war. It seemed like an impossible equation, but the decision was made to do it anyway. And this is exactly where SOE's mad genius came into play. At SOE headquarters in London, a plan began to take shape. This plan was so bold, so crazy, and so dangerous that if it failed, it could cause an international scandal, but if it succeeded, it would deal an incredible blow to the enemy. The plan's name carried a simple but effective message: Operation Postmaster. Just as a postman delivers a package and quietly disappears, the SOE agents would take these ships and vanish. But implementing this plan required a special team. Ordinary soldiers wouldn't be enough for this job. They needed SOE's best men. Men who could walk in shadows, who never lost their cool, who could kill when necessary, but preferably work without leaving any trace. And these men were already waiting in the hot hell of Africa. SOE's West Africa station was based in Lagos. This was a tough assignment where tropical heat, mosquitoes, and malaria ran rampant. But the agents there were accustomed to harsh conditions, and it was perfectly positioned as a base for the Fernando Po operation. At the head of the Lagos station was one of the heroes of this story, Gus March-Phillipps. Handsome, charismatic, and insanely brave, March-Phillipps was one of SOE's most legendary agents. He had previously served as the founder of the small-scale raiding force in England. He was an expert at infiltrating behind enemy lines with small teams and creating chaos. Alongside March-Phillipps was a collection of extraordinary individuals: Geoffrey Appleyard, an intelligent and cool-headed officer; Graham Hayes, a commando famous for his courage; Anders Lassen, a Danish hero who would later earn the Victoria Cross, and many others. These men would infiltrate a neutral harbor, steal enemy ships, and disappear without creating an international incident. But how? If you have any ideas, you can write them in the comments. Here's where the genius part of the plan came into play. SOE strategists had noticed that the Spanish garrison on Fernando Po and German and Italian ship crews were extremely comfortable and complacent. In this remote corner of the war, no one expected an attack. Social life on the island was quite active, and one of the most important events was the cocktail parties held periodically. The plan would work like this. SOE agents would infiltrate the island in advance and arrange for a party night. Spanish officials and German and Italian ship crews would be invited to this party. While everyone was drinking and having fun, the SOE raiding team would descend on the harbor and steal the ships.
Sounds simple, doesn't it? But remember, the devil is in the details. What you're about to hear will surprise you even more. First, an infiltration operation had to be launched. One of SOE's most valuable agents in West Africa was a man named Richard Lippett. Lippett had gone to Fernando Po disguised as a businessman and managed to infiltrate the island's social circles. He had befriended Spanish officials and shared drinks with German and Italian sailors. And throughout all of this, he was gathering valuable intelligence for SOE. When Lippett's reports reached London, SOE planners smiled. Security on the ships was extremely lax. The crews spent most nights partying on shore or hanging out at bars in town. Only a few watchmen remained on the ships, and most importantly, Spanish officials never even considered the possibility of a British attack. But the risks were still enormous. If the operation failed, the SOE agents would either be killed or captured. If they were captured, Spain's entry into the war would be inevitable, and Britain could worsen its already very difficult position even further. Of course, every detail was being considered. Churchill's approval was needed. When the operation file reached the Prime Minister's desk, Churchill's eyes lit up. This was exactly his style, a bold, crazy operation that could potentially change the course of the war. Churchill gave his approval, and Operation Postmaster got the green light. There was no turning back now. In early January 1942, preparations intensified. The SOE team assembled in Lagos. The vessel to be used was selected, a boat called the Maid Honor Force. This boat looked like an ordinary fishing vessel on the surface, but underneath it had powerful engines and hidden weapon compartments. The team examined every detail of the operation. Maps of the harbor were drawn up. The positions of the ships were determined. The routines of enemy watchmen were analyzed. Escape routes were planned. Every possibility was considered. And then the date of the party was set, January 14, 1942. That night, everything in Santa Isabel Harbor appeared normal. Spanish officials, German and Italian sailors, and the island's elite had gathered at one of the city's most luxurious venues. Glasses were being raised, laughter filled the air, and music was playing. No one was aware of the danger approaching in the darkness. Because at that very moment, just a few hundred meters from the harbor, the Maid Honor Force was gliding silently through the waters. On deck, SOE agents with faces painted black, armed to the teeth, waited. Their heartbeats quickened, adrenaline surging through their veins. Gus March-Phillipps looked at his men in the darkness. Tonight, they would either win a glorious victory or vanish as a mere footnote in the pages of history. There was no middle ground. And then the signal was given. Part 1 ends here, but in Part 2, we'll tell you about that breathtaking night of the operation, what was happening simultaneously inside the party and at the harbor, the confrontations, and exactly how the ships were stolen, down to the finest details. If you're curious, subscribe now and let's continue.
Welcome to Part 2, everyone. Let's continue. January 14th, 1942. The time is approaching 11 p.m. In Santa Isabel's most luxurious venue, crystal chandeliers sparkle brilliantly. Popular songs of the era rise from the gramophone. Waiters in white tuxedos carry champagne glasses on silver trays. Spanish colonial administrators glide across the dance floor with their wives. German and Italian ship officers have loosened their uniform collars, sipping their drinks in complete relaxation. The captain of the Duchessa d'Aosta is telling a joke to the Spanish colonel beside him. Laughter echoes through the hall. The engineer of the Likomba is busy flirting with a Spanish beauty in the corner. A few sailors from the Bibundi's crew are about to finish off a whiskey bottle at the bar counter. No one knows that this night will be the longest night of their lives. A few kilometers from the city, in the pitch-black waters of the Gulf of Guinea, the Maid Honor Force is silently taking position. On the deck of the boat, 14 shadow figures wait motionless. Their faces are covered with black camouflage paint. In their hands are Tommy guns, knives at their belts, plastic explosives in their pockets. They're standing by, ready for action. When Gus March-Phillipps looked toward the shore, he can see the lights of Santa Isabel. The music from the party venue faintly reaches his ears with the wind. A cold smile appears on his lips. While the enemy celebrates, death is gliding toward them. But tonight, March-Phillips's team is not alone. SOE's plan had to work like clockwork. Multiple teams would move with perfect coordination. The main raiding team would capture the ships, a second team would secure the shore, and a third group would block any potential reinforcements. Everything was planned down to the minute, and the party's role lay at the heart of this plan. The party idea had come from the brain of Leonard Guys, SOE's West Africa station chief. Guys had noticed that social life on Fernando provided perfect cover for the operation. The island's Spanish elite regularly threw parties, and German and Italian ship officers were also invited to these gatherings. SOE used Richard Lippett, the agent they had previously placed on the island. Lippett had infiltrated the island's high society under the guise of a local businessman. Through weeks of patient work, he had built friendships with Spanish officials and earned their trust, and now he would take on the most critical part of the operation. Lippett's task was simple but vital. Organize a party for the night of January 14th and ensure enemy officers stayed away from their ships. The elegant irony of British intelligence lay precisely here. They wouldn't kill their enemies, they would keep them occupied with drinks and entertainment. This was a gentlemanly theft in the middle of a war. Lippett began laying the groundwork for the party weeks in advance. He had conversations with the island's prominent figures, prepared invitations, and arranged the venue. He built a rapport with the captain of the Duchessa d'Aosta and personally invited him to the party. The Italian captain couldn't refuse such a gracious invitation. As the party night approached, Lippett's hands were trembling, but his face showed nothing. Years of working for British intelligence had taught him one thing: you can feel fear, but you can never show it. If this content interests you and you want to discover more hidden stories from history, subscribe now, because on this channel you'll find stories that textbooks never tell. Let's continue. Now let's return to that night. When the party began at 10 p.m., everything looked perfect. The captain of the Duchessa d'Aosta and several of his officers had arrived. There were also names from the crews of the Likomba and Bibundi. Only a skeleton watch crew remained on the ships, exactly as SOE wanted. But an unexpected problem arose. The first officer of the Duchessa d'Aosta had decided not to come to the party. He would stay on the ship and stand watch. This could jeopardize the plan. The SOE team might face more resistance than expected on the ship. When March-Phillipps received this news, he frowned but didn't change the plan. SOE agents were trained to handle unexpected situations. A few extra watchmen wouldn't stop these men.
As midnight approached, the Maid Honor Force began its final approach maneuvers. The boat had reduced its engines to minimum, silently creeping toward Santa Isabel Harbor. The moon had hidden behind clouds. Darkness was their friend. March-Phillipps gathered his men for the operation's final briefing. His tone was calm but decisive.
Alpha Team would take the Duchessa d'Aosta. This was the biggest and most important target. Bravo Team would board the Likomba. Charlie Team would capture the Bibundi. After reaching their target ship, each team would first neutralize the watchmen, then cut the anchors and tow the ship to open sea. What if the Spanish garrison intervened? March-Phillipps read this question in his men's eyes. His answer was clear. You will not open fire. No matter what, you will not open fire. If we open fire, this becomes an act of war, and Spain enters the war. A single bullet could ruin the entire operation. This required incredible self-discipline. These men would fight for their lives, but couldn't use their weapons, at least not against the Spanish. The German and Italian crew was a different matter. They were legitimate enemies and would be neutralized if necessary. 11:15 p.m. The Maid Honor Force stopped half a mile from the harbor. From here on, the operation would be conducted in small boats. The team silently descended into rubber dinghies. Oars dipped into the water, and they began advancing through the darkness. The silence of the harbor was eerie. The music from the party could be faintly heard in the distance, but the harbor itself was dead silent. Apart from an occasional seagull's cry or the sound of waves slapping against hulls, there was nothing. Anders Lassen, the Danish commando, was rowing at the front of his team. This man was one of the most dangerous men of the war. He would later become a legend in the Special Air Service and earn the Victoria Cross, but that night he was just a silent shadow. When Lassen's boat approached the massive hull of the Duchessa d'Aosta, he could hear his heart pounding. This 7,000-ton steel monster rose like a mountain in the darkness. A few scattered lights were on along the deck. A few watchmen were probably dozing. Lassen signaled his team. Silence. A rope ladder was thrown, the hook secured to the ship's gunwale. The first agent began climbing. Behind him, the second, the third. Rubber-soled shoes made not the slightest sound on the metal deck. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe now, thank you. The first watchman was just lighting a cigarette when he collapsed without feeling the blow from behind. SOE agents were masters of silent neutralization techniques. Within a minute, all 3 watchmen on deck were unconscious. But the real problem was below, in the engine room. The first officer of the Duchessa d'Aosta, as mentioned earlier, had stayed on the ship, and at that moment he was in the engine room, checking the watch log. When the SOE agents opened the door, the Italian officer stared at them in shock. There was a moment of silence. The Italian saw the black paint on the strangers' faces, the weapons in their hands. He opened his mouth to shout. But before he could make a sound, an SOE agent leapt on him. A brief struggle ensued. The Italian officer was strong and resisted desperately, but SOE training wasn't street fighting. Within seconds, the Italian officer was neutralized and bound. March-Phillipps asked about the status of the other teams over the radio. Bravo Team had captured the Likomba. Resistance was minimal. 2 German sailors had been tied up. Charlie Team had encountered a minor problem on the Bibundi. A watchman had tried to escape but was caught. So far, everything was going according to plan, but the hardest part hadn't begun yet, getting the ships out of the harbor. This is where SOE's engineering genius came into play. Silently removing a ship as large as the Duchessa d'Aosta from the harbor was normally next to impossible. Starting the ship's engines would make noise and wake the Spanish garrison. Raising the anchors the traditional way would take hours. SOE's solution was elegant and brutal: plastic explosives.
The agents placed pre-prepared explosive packages on the anchor chains. These packages were designed to produce maximum cutting power with minimum noise. Timers were set, and then they waited. At the party, it was past midnight. Drinks were flowing, laughter was rising. The captain of the Duchessa d'Aosta, having had a bit too much champagne, had sprawled out on a couch. Unaware that his ship was being captured at that very moment, he was listening to a boring story from a Spanish colonial official. Lippet glanced at his watch. He was trembling inside, but his face was calm. If everything was going according to plan, the ships were now under SOE control. But the critical moment hadn't arrived yet. And then, shortly after midnight, a muffled explosion sound came from the distance. At the party venue, several people turned their heads. What was that sound? Someone pointed towards the harbor. No one was sure. The captain of the Duchessa d'Aosta suddenly sprang to his feet. His instincts told him something was wrong. His ship. Had something happened to his ship? But it was too late. Are you enjoying this story? At the harbor, the anchor chains of all three ships had been cut simultaneously. The explosives had done their job perfectly. The ships were now free. The SOE teams moved quickly. Pre-arranged tugboats were connected to the ships with ropes. 2 tugboats were needed for the Duchessa d'Aosta. Its massive hull couldn't be towed by one alone. The Likomba and Bibundi were smaller. Towing them was relatively easy. Engines were started and the ship slowly began to move. It was at this exact moment that the Spanish garrison woke up. From the watchtower at the harbor head, a spotlight pierced the darkness. The light swept over the moving ships. A Spanish officer began shouting through a megaphone, "Stop! Who are you? What are you doing?" But it was too late. The SOE agents didn't respond. The ships were picking up speed. The Spanish garrison went on alert. Soldiers began running about, but they didn't know what to do. Should they open fire? At whom? The ships were already leaving the harbor. The garrison commander faced a critical decision. If he gave the order to fire, this would become an international incident. If he didn't, enemy ships were being stolen before his very eyes. In the end, he decided not to open fire. This decision probably prevented Spain from entering the war, but that night the garrison commander wasn't aware of this. He just watched in bewilderment as 3 ships disappeared into the darkness. Chaos reigned at the party. The captain of the Duchessa d'Aosta was running toward the harbor like a madman. But when he arrived, he found only an empty pier. His ship had vanished into the darkness of the Atlantic. The Italian captain fell to his knees. His career was over. A court-martial was inevitable. And the most painful part was that he couldn't even understand how this had happened. March-Phillipps, on the bridge of the Duchessa d'Aosta, watched the silhouette of the African coast receding. A victory smile was on his lips. They had accomplished the impossible. Operation Postmaster was complete. 3 enemy ships had been stolen from a neutral country's harbor without a single British casualty. Only a few of the enemy crew had been injured, and they would be treated. The Spanish hadn't opened fire. SOE had proven once again that courage and intelligence were more powerful than numerical superiority. But the story doesn't end here. The ships headed toward the predetermined rendezvous point off the coast of Lagos. Royal Navy ships were waiting to meet them. The Duchessa d'Aosta was seized as a war prize and taken into British service. The Likomba and Bibundi shared the same fate. But the real impact of the operation was far greater than the stolen ships. The news from Fernando hit the world press like a bomb. The Spanish government was seething with rage. Franco summoned the British ambassador to protest. The German and Italian governments swore revenge. So what did Britain do? It denied it, completely denied it. The British government announced it had no connection to the operation whatsoever. According to the official statement, the ships had probably been stolen by local pirates or smugglers in Africa. Britain would never disrespect the sovereignty of a neutral country. This denial was so brazen and so masterful that even the Spanish were half forced to believe it. After all, did Britain have the capacity to conduct an operation on an island as remote as Fernando Po? Maybe they really were pirates. Of course, the Spanish knew the truth, but they had no concrete evidence, and without evidence, they couldn't declare war on Britain. This diplomatic dance was the most brilliant part of SOE's plan. They had thought not just about the operation, but what came after. Deniability had been calculated down to every detail. SOE agents were hailed as heroes, but secretly. Official medals were awarded, but no ceremonies were held. March-Phillipps and his team were written into history's secret pages. And Ian Fleming? Fleming, the creator of James Bond, was working in British naval intelligence at the time. When he read the files of Operation Postmaster, his imagination caught fire. Years later, echoes of this operation would be clearly felt in the adventures of 007. Part 2 ends here. In the third and final part, we'll tell you about what happened after the operation, the fate of SOE heroes, this story's impact on the course of the war, and the full story of the James Bond connection. History is sometimes crazier than fiction. Don't miss the final part. Subscribe now, and we're moving on to the last episode. Let's continue from the final part. On a cold January morning in 1942, Lagos Harbor witnessed an extraordinary scene. 3 ships were entering the harbor with British flags waving. The massive hull of the Duchessa gleamed in the morning sun. Behind it, the Likomba and Bibundi glided like small but proud members of a victory parade. The British officers waiting at the pier couldn't believe their eyes. It was an incredible sight. SOE had accomplished the impossible once again. Huge congratulations to these heroes. March-Phillipps and his men were welcomed as heroes, but this welcome was secret, silent, and would never appear in official records. That was the nature of SOE. You work in shadows, win victories in shadows, and disappear into shadows. But even in the shadows, these men had changed the course of history. The strategic importance of Operation Postmaster was far greater than the value of the stolen ships. Yes, the Duchessa was a valuable prize. Yes, the Likomba and Bibundi had dealt a blow to German naval capacity. But the real victory was won in the psychological and political arena. First, this operation sent a clear message to Nazi Germany. Nowhere is safe. Not even neutral harbors can protect you. The British will find you and strike you even in the most remote corner of the world. This message deeply affected German naval strategy. From then on, German ships in neutral harbors had to be much more cautious. Extra security measures, extra watchmen, extra paranoia. All of this drained German resources and reduced their operational flexibility. Second, the operation sent British morale soaring. In early 1942, things weren't looking bright for the Allies. Singapore was about to fall. Rommel was advancing in North Africa. Submarines were prowling the Atlantic. In such dark days, the news from Fernando Po was a ray of light. The British could still fight. They could still win. They could still strike the enemy where he least expected it. The third and perhaps most important outcome was the preservation of Spain's neutrality. Franco was furious but didn't enter the war. Just as SOE had calculated, the deniability strategy had worked. The Spanish couldn't act without concrete evidence in their hands. This simple fact was important enough to change the course of the war. If Spain had joined the Axis powers, Gibraltar would have been in danger. If Gibraltar fell, the Mediterranean would be closed off. If the Mediterranean was closed, the North Africa campaign would become impossible. The dominoes would fall one after another, and the course of history would change completely. It was a critically important operation. Operation Postmaster prevented those dominoes from falling. But every victory demands a price, and the heroes of this story would pay that price in the heaviest way. Gus March-Phillipps returned to England after the Fernando Po victory. SOE was waiting for him with new assignments. He was now a proven legend and had become the first name that came to mind for the most dangerous operations. In the autumn of 1942, March-Phillipps led a reconnaissance raid on the French coast. This operation, called Operation Aquatint, was designed to gather intelligence on the Normandy beaches. It was one of the small operations that heralded D-Day. But this time, luck was not on his side. On the night of September 12, 1942, when March-Phillipps and his team landed on the French coast, German patrols were waiting for them. Whether there was a tip-off or just bad luck was never known, but the result was tragic. A fierce firefight broke out. March-Phillipps stayed behind to ensure his men could withdraw. Under German fire, he fought bravely, but the bullets were too heavy. Gus March-Phillipps lost his life that night on the French coast. He was 34 years old. His body was never found. The sea probably took him, hiding him forever. But his legacy lived on. One of SOE's brightest stars had been extinguished in the darkness, but his light would continue to shine for generations. March-Phillipps' death was a great loss for SOE, but war doesn't stop, and the fight had to continue. Jeffrey Appleyard, March-Phillipps' closest brother-in-arms, couldn't find time to mourn him. He himself continued on dangerous missions. In 1943, he served in the Sicily operations, and in July 1943, he lost his life in a plane crash. Another hero was gone. Anders Lawson survived until the end of the war, but his story also ended in tragedy. This Danish warrior served in the most dangerous operations of the Special Air Service. He became a legend in Italy, Greece, and Yugoslavia. In April 1945, the war was almost over. Germany was collapsing. Everyone was expecting peace. But Lawson went out on one final mission. At Lake Comacchio in Italy, he attacked German positions. That night, Anders Lawson single-handedly neutralized 3 separate German machine gun nests. He protected his men, repelled the enemy, but while taking the last position, a German bullet found him. Anders Lawson died on April 9, 1945. There was only 1 month left until the war's end. His courage was so extraordinary that he was awarded the Victoria Cross. This was the highest honor the British military could bestow, and Lawson became the only Dane to receive this medal in World War II. Most of the shadows who climbed onto the ships on that dark night in Fernando Po never saw the end of the war. Young men gave their lives for freedom. Their names remained in classified files, their graves often lost in unmarked lands. But what they did changed the course of history. Don't forget to subscribe for these heroes. Let's continue telling their story. If you're watching this video and want to hear more of these stories, don't forget to subscribe. Every week we bring out unforgettable stories like this from the dusty pages of history. Now, let's look at perhaps the most interesting part of this story, the James Bond connection. Ian Fleming. This name went down in history as the creator of one of world literature's most iconic characters, James Bond, 007. The British super agent who could do anything, get any woman, defeat any villain. But Fleming didn't create Bond from his imagination. Bond was born from the shadows of real heroes. Fleming worked in British naval intelligence during World War II.
His job was to coordinate secret operations and perform intelligence analysis. This position gave him access to SOE's most classified files. When the reports of Operation Postmaster reached Fleming's desk, his eyes lit up. This story had all the elements of the novels he would later write. An exotic location, a dangerous mission, brave agents, beautiful women and cocktail parties, enemy ships, and night raids. Never Fleming forgot this operation. After the war, Fleming turned to writing and published his first James Bond novel, Casino Royale, in 1953. The book became a worldwide phenomenon, and careful readers could see echoes of Operation Postmaster in Bond's adventures. Exotic Caribbean islands and African coasts, raids on enemy ships, intelligence operations conducted at cocktail parties, secret missions carried out in neutral countries. All of these were filtered from Fleming's wartime experiences. It's even said that some Bond characters were inspired by real SOE agents. March-Phillipps' charisma, Lassen's cool composure, Appleyard's intelligence, all had mixed into Bond's DNA. Of course, Bond was a fictional character, and much luckier than real SOE agents. Bond always wins, always survives, always gets the girl. In real life, things weren't that simple. Real heroes died, real operations could fail, real prices were paid. But Fleming's genius was capturing the essence of reality. Bond was the idealized version of the SOE spirit. He was the symbol of courage, intelligence, composure, and love of country, and this symbol inspired millions of people for generations. Operation Postmaster was James Bond's spiritual father, and in every Bond film, every novel, the ghost of that dark night in Fernando Poe lingered. So, what do we learn from this story? Perhaps the most important lesson is about the definition of courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is taking action despite fear. March-Phillipps and his men were afraid. Infiltrating a neutral harbor, stealing enemy ships, taking the risk of creating an international incident, these were things to be feared. But they did it anyway, because they did what needed to be done, because freedom was more important than comfort, because some things were worth dying for. This spirit forms the foundation of the Anglo-American world. Britain and America had stood against tyrants throughout history, against Napoleon, against the Kaiser, against Hitler, against Stalin. Every time a price was paid, but every time freedom won. Operation Postmaster was a shining example of this tradition. A handful of brave men had challenged the world's most powerful tyrant, and they had won. Today, few people remain in Fernando Poe who remember that night. Santa Isabel Harbor has changed, modernized, with no trace of how it was back then. The Duchessa de Aosta has long since been scrapped. The names of March-Phillipps and his friends live only in classified files known to history enthusiasts. But the legacy lives on. In every SOE operation, in every Special Forces raid, in every brave act by secret services, the spirit of Fernando Poe is there. The modern SAS, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, SOE is in all their DNA. And one of SOE's finest moments was written on that January night. History's heroes often remain nameless. Their medals are given in secret ceremonies, their stories kept in classified files. But this doesn't diminish their value. On the contrary, it increases it, because they fought not for fame, but for what was right. Gus March-Phillipps, Jeffrey Appleyard, Anders Lawson, and all the nameless heroes of Operation Postmaster were representatives of this tradition. Thanks to them, we live in a free world today. Without their sacrifice, history could have been written very differently. And now, this story comes to an end, but our journey is not over. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know which secret operation you're curious about.
because history is far crazier than textbooks tell you, and we will continue to tell these crazy stories. In our next video, we'll tell another incredible story from World War II. This time, the stage is Norway's frozen fjords. The target? A facility that would destroy Hitler's atomic bomb dreams. The heroes? A handful of Norwegian resistance fighters crossing mountains on skis. Operation Gunnerside, the end of the Nazi nuclear program. History's most daring sabotage operation. This story is as crazy as Fernando Poe, and an adventure whose consequences perhaps changed the entire war. If you enjoyed this video, don't miss the next one. See you in the secret pages of history. Bye-bye.